Glad you could join us this morning in our continuing study of Mark's Gospel. In our last session, Mark enabled us to follow Jesus and the 12 as they traveled outside of Israel on an apostles' training expedition. In Tyre, Jesus used an interaction with a Syrian woman to teach the 12 that salvation was a gift to all, Jew and Gentile alike. Later, in the Decapolis, Jesus healed a deaf, mute person to demonstrate that his power and authority went beyond the physical to the mental. Jesus had his authority over the fullness of creation and humanity in both physical, mental, and spiritual sense. Today we turn to chapter 8, where Mark continues his fast-paced account of Jesus' ministry. We will begin with the feeding of the 4,000 before Jesus teaches a lesson about the Pharisees and King Herod Antipas. Then we will follow Jesus back to Bethsaida and Caesarea Philippi, where the 12 learn additional important truths about the Messiah and their role in the formation of the church. Let us begin by reading the first dozen verses of chapter 8. During those days, another large crowd gathered. Since they had nothing to eat, Jesus called his disciples to him and said, "I have compassion for these people. They have already been with me for 3 days and have nothing to eat. If I send them home hungry, they will collapse on the way, because some of them have come a long distance." His disciples answered, "But where in this remote place can anyone get enough bread to feed them?" "How many loaves do you have?" Jesus asked. 7, they replied. He told the crowd to sit down on the ground. When he had taken the 7 loaves and given thanks, he broke them and gave them to his disciples to distribute to the people. And they did so. Then they had a few small fish as well. He gave thanks for them also and told the disciples to distribute them. The people ate and were satisfied. After the disciples picked up 7 basketfuls of broken pieces that were left over. About 4,000 people were present. After he had sent them away, he got into the boat with his disciples and went to the region of Dalmatia. The Pharisees came and began to question Jesus. To test him, they asked him for a sign from heaven. He sighed deeply and said, "Why does this generation ask for a sign? Truly I tell you, no sign will be given to it." Then he left them, got back into the boat, and crossed to the other side. The first feeding of the 5,000 took place on the north side of the Sea of Galilee, near the time of Passover. We learn that from John chapter 6 and verse 4. At this time, the hillsides and shorelines of the lake would be lush with green grass. This event likely took place a few months later, during the heat of the summer months. Perhaps it was because of the arid conditions that this crowd was slightly smaller than the similar event that we discussed in chapter 6. Yet Mark makes it clear that this again was a large crowd, hungry for food as well as for the words of Jesus. While scholars agree on the location of the feeding of the 5,000, there are 2 potential locations that could be the location of this miracle. In verse 10, Mark mentions a town called Dalmatia. In Matthew's parallel account, Matthew 15, verse 39, the town is referred to as Magadan. The location of both towns is murky, and there is evidence for locations on both the east and the west side of the lake. I find the clearest reading is to assume that the event took place on the eastern side of the lake, and then they traveled to the other side, Magdala, on the western shore. But neither the precise location nor the weather is important in this lesson. There are a few more important things that Jesus wanted them and us to understand. In verse 2, Mark notes that Jesus had compassion on the people. While all four gospel writers make this point, only here and in Matthew's parallel account did Jesus declare this about himself in the first person. On this occasion, Jesus felt compassion because they had remained with him for 3 days in spite of the hot sun, the arid conditions, and growing hunger. Yet the fullness of Scripture makes it abundantly clear that God has great compassion for those who follow him. When the 12 wanted Jesus to send the people away, Jesus refused, demanding that they find a way to care for the needs of these people. Apparently, the 12 had not yet learned this lesson from only a few short months ago, so Jesus needed to reteach them. A few months ago, they had 5 loaves and 2 fish. In this reteaching, the 12 find 7 loaves and a few fish. Once again, Jesus prays for the food and then asks the apostles to distribute it. Once again, every person eats until they are satisfied. Once again, an abundance of food remains, 7 baskets full of food. Not only does Jesus have compassion, but he also has the power to take care of our needs in abundance. In this case, Jesus used food as the example to teach this concept, but we experience his power to act on his compassion throughout the Gospels. Power to control the physical environment, power to control the physical body, power to instantly teach the deaf and mute man to speak, power over spiritual forces and the evil one. Not only is God compassionate, but he has the ability to satisfy, heal, and care for our every need. Not only is this true for the Jews, but it is true for the Gentiles as well. Upon pulling the boat on the western shore, the Pharisees immediately approached Jesus. They demanded that Jesus perform a miracle to prove to them who he was. Since they had already made up their minds about Jesus and were merely asking a reason to discredit him, Jesus declined. What does this generation ask for? This is a timeless question, asked by unbelievers of every generation. Even today, those in the secular world ask for a personal miracle. God responds to them in the same way that Jesus responded to the Pharisees. He got back into the boat and went away. This is free will in action. Let us pause for a moment to discuss this passage. How were the 2 feeding miracles similar? How were the 2 feeding miracles different? What lessons do you glean from this passage? What lessons do you glean from Jesus' response to the Pharisees? Let us continue reading at verses 14 through 21, where Jesus has a few more lessons for the apostles. The disciples had forgotten to bring bread except for 1 loaf they had with them in the boat. Be careful, Jesus warned them. Watch out for the yeast of the Pharisees and that of Herod. They discussed this with one another and said, "Is it because we have no bread?" Aware of their discussion, Jesus asked them, "Why are you talking about having no bread? Do you still not see or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Do you have eyes but fail to see, and ears but fail to hear? And don't you remember, when I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many basketfuls of pieces did you pick up?" 12, they replied. And when I broke the 7 loaves for the 4,000, how many basketfuls of pieces did you pick up? They answered, 7. He said to them, "Do you still not understand?" As the boat pulls away from the western shore, They are likely heading for the northern coast near the town of Bethsaida. Apparently, they left 7 basketfuls of food behind because Mark notes that they only had a single loaf of bread in the boat. Jesus takes advantage of this situation to make an important point to his apostles. Be careful, Jesus warns them. Watch out for the yeast of the Pharisees and that of King Herod. As the 12 discuss Jesus' comment, it is clear that they still do not understand the lesson. At least one of them wondered if this was his response to the fact that they had forgotten to bring along the extra bread. Having their full attention now, Jesus chides them a bit with the comments about seeing, understanding, and having hardened hearts. Jesus gets to his point in verse 19 when he asked the 12 about the 2 recent experiences. How many baskets when I fed 5,000? 12. Yes. And how many baskets this time? 7. Do you still not understand? Let us answer this question for a moment. What did Jesus want the 12 to understand? Unlike the Pharisees, the 12 really wanted to understand. Since the Holy Spirit was not yet available to teach them, Jesus was more than willing to be their patient instructor. When I was a teacher, I often had to reteach a concept. It was always a joy to watch someone who finally understands. Jesus would certainly know when the 12 finally understood the concepts that he wished to convey. Guys, listen. 2 food miracles. What happened both times? How many baskets? Okay, for a third time. I have the power to meet all of your needs. This 1 loaf in the boat will be plenty. Trust me, Peter. Trust me, John. Trust me, each one of you 12. Let us continue reading at verse 22 through 25. They came to Bethsaida, and some people brought a blind man and begged Jesus to touch him. He took the blind man by the hand and led him outside of the village. When he had spit on the man's eyes and put his hands on him, Jesus asked, "Do you see anything?" He looked up and said, "I see people. They look like trees walking around." Once more Jesus put his hands on the man's eyes. Then the man's eyes were opened, his sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. Jesus sent him home, saying, "Don't even go into the village of Bethsaida." As they arrive on the shores of Bethsaida, a blind man is brought to Jesus. In the 1st century, blindness created the most helpless suffering for any person. Those who were blind were reduced to begging and relying on their families for care and support. Worse yet, blindness was considered a curse from God, making this ailment doubly painful. These people begged Jesus to touch him and heal him from his suffering. As Jesus has done before, he takes the man outside of Bethsaida to a place of relative privacy. Then Jesus spit on the man's eyes and touches his eyes. At that point, Jesus asks the man if he sees anything. While the man's vision is better, it is clearly not yet normal. So Jesus touches the man a second time, and this time he is completely healed. Jesus instructs this man not to even return to the village. I suppose Jesus makes this request so that the news of this man's healing doesn't travel too quickly. But what we are to make of this 2-part healing? I think this was a lesson for the 12, and it underscores the truths that Jesus has been wanting to convey to them over the last few months. The lesson of the 2 feeding miracles was that Jesus had compassion and power to meet their every need in abundance. Since the 12 had seen Jesus heal so many others, They probably believed that Jesus would heal this man fully on the first touch, as had always happened. When Jesus first asked the man, "Do you see anything?" I think the 12 were shocked at this man's response. Granted, there was only a moment before the man was fully and abundantly healed, but that moment contained a lesson, or perhaps even two, for the apostles and for us. First and foremost, I think that Jesus wanted to convey to the 12 the importance of trusting in Christ, even when things go unexpectedly. Don't allow a moment of doubt or an unexpected outcome to cause you to lose your faith. Some scholars find a second lesson in this passage. They suggest that Jesus sought to teach the 12 a lesson about temporary spiritual blindness. Like this blind man, it has taken some time for the apostles to fully understand the lessons that Jesus wanted to teach them. They can and should expect that many will suffer temporary spiritual blindness, which will be overcome. Let us continue reading verses 27 through 30. Jesus and his disciples went on to the villages around Caesarea Philippi. On the way he asked them, "Who do people say that I am?" They replied, "Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others, one of the prophets." "But what about you?" he asked. "Who do you say that I am?" Peter answered, "You are the Messiah." Jesus warned them not to tell anybody about this. This is a fascinating passage, and Mark covers it so briefly that I feel compelled to supplement with Matthew and Luke's account. After his final miracle in Bethsaida, Jesus took the 12 on a journey north some 25 miles to Caesarea Philippi, situated at the foot of Mount Hermon, near a spring that is the source of the Jordan River. Caesarea Philippi was formerly known as Panias, after the Greek god Pan. The community itself was largely populated by Gentiles, and it was filled with pagan idols. There was a large cave near the area from which smoke billowed that became known as the gates of hell. It is interesting that Jesus would use this evil place as the backdrop to his final teaching of the apostles prior to his journey to Jerusalem. In a way, this trip was the final oral examination for those selected to build the church. Jesus asked his first question in verse 27, "Who do people say that I am?" This question was directed at the common people and not the Pharisees and religious leaders. "Who do the crowds of people that flock to me in the Galilee say that I am?" The answer provided by the 12 is not a surprise to us. Some, like Herod Antipas, think it was John the Baptist. Others think that Jesus was Elijah, and still others feel that Jesus is one of the other prophets. In all three cases, the general belief is that Jesus is a resurrected human prophet. They would claim that Jesus is able to do miracles just as Moses and Elijah could do miracles. I would venture that the majority of secular people today would answer in a similar fashion. Jesus was a good man or a good teacher. Some might even say he was a good prophet, but they would stop at that point. In essence, they would conclude that Jesus was merely a human. At that point, Jesus turned slightly to directly face Peter. The second final exam question is aimed directly at him. "Who do you say that I am?" We all know that Peter answered correctly, "You are the Messiah." Matthew adds the phrase, "the Son of the living God." This is the one jaw-dropping question that every human must answer for themselves. For us here today, this is not a difficult question, but we have clear advantages over Peter and the other disciples. We have not been raised with the understanding that the coming Messiah would be a military deliverer who would overthrow the Roman government and institute Jewish autonomy. Moreover, Jesus had already been rejected by the Jewish religious leaders. How could Jesus be the Messiah? In Matthew chapter 16, verse 17, it is noted that Jesus' response to Peter was, "Blessed are you, because flesh and blood did not reveal this to you, but my Father who is in heaven." Mark merely concludes with Jesus' direction to not speak this truth to anyone. Let us pause to discuss this answer to this question. Who do you say that Jesus is? During the same trip, Jesus instructed the 12 on another important truth. Let us continue reading at verses 31 through 38. He then began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed and after 3 days rise again. He spoke plainly about this, and Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But when Jesus turned and looked at his disciple, he rebuked Peter. "Get behind me, Satan," he said. "You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns." When he called the crowd to him along with his disciples and said, "Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me and for the gospel will save it. What good is it for someone to gain the whole world yet forfeit their soul? Or what can anyone give in exchange for their soul? If anyone is ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, the Son of Man will be ashamed of them when he comes to his Father's glory with the holy angels." The last thing that the 12 expected to hear following the question about Jesus as Messiah was this truth about Jesus. They knew that Jesus was the Messiah, but they could not balance that with suffering and with death. Mark notes that Jesus began to teach them about his death, indicating that from this point forward, his death would be a repeated thing. The title Son of Man is the phrase that Jesus applied to himself more than 80 times in the Gospels. Now that the disciples understood that Jesus was also the Son of God, they needed to understand what it means for him to also be the Son of Man. As Jesus foretells what will take place, he explains that he must suffer many things. Though Peter had yet failed to grasp that understanding, it would soon be burned into his mind, as it would be burned into the mind of each of the apostles. Not only would Jesus suffer physically, he would suffer mentally and spiritually. He would be rejected by the religious leaders, but he would also be rejected by the very people that he had healed and helped. Still worse, I believe, the 12 would abandon him to suffer alone. However, the worst part of the crucifixion would not be the physical torment, nor the mental anguish of abandonment. The fact that God himself, God the Father, would turn his back on him was unbearable. It is understandable that Peter was shocked by the words of Jesus. Yet Jesus could not afford any misunderstandings here, and especially from Peter. I imagine that Jesus got Peter's attention immediately when he stated, "Get behind me, Satan," in verse 33. By leveling this devastating rebuke on Peter, Jesus makes clear the importance of the role that Jesus was to follow, that being the cross. Satan had tempted Jesus years earlier, and Peter could not be allowed to get in the way of Jesus' destiny. Satan had tempted Jesus years earlier, and Peter could not be allowed to get in the way of Jesus' destiny. While Peter erred greatly on this day near Caesarea Philippi, he would soon come to understand and cherish the cross deeply. Less than a year later, on the day of Pentecost, Peter would stand in Jerusalem and declare the gospel of the crucified and resurrected Messiah. Peter still had some other truths to learn, but I'd venture that none were more difficult than this day when Jesus faced him and said, "Get behind me, Satan." We must learn from Peter's mistakes and not let our good intentions get in the way of God's will. Mark concludes his narrative with a short but important message from Jesus that brings clarity to Peter's situation. There is a cost involved in being a follower of Jesus. Being a follower of Jesus means that we will need to deny ourselves and our desires at times. In fact, following Jesus will sometimes mean that we are in conflict with our culture, and we need to accept this fact. Jesus refers to this as taking up our cross. Jesus summarizes this in verse 38. If anyone is ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, the Son of God will be ashamed of him when he comes into his Father's glory. May we be cognizant of this truth. Let us spend a moment in discussion of this question.